Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today it's time to do the Week in 9 review of the 2023 USFL season. Despite there only being now 1 week left of the regular season, we still basically have a completely wide open playoff picture. So let's look at what happened this past week and look onwards to next week in the week review. So without further ado, the scores. In the opening game, the Maulers ended up beating the Panthers 19-7. Then we had a complete blowout and the Breakers destroying the Showboats 31-3. Very reminiscent of the Showboat Stallions game a few weeks ago. Speaking of the Stallions, they won their game against the Gamblers and became the first and only team currently to clinch their ticket to the postseason, being 7-2 now. Then the Generals ended up beating the Stars in a very close game that really wasn't that close until the very end. So let's get right into it. The Maulers Panthers. This was a game where it was very obvious whose fault it was, because this is one of the very rare occasions where you can basically pinpoint one guy for losing. Now, I say basically because there were a couple of drops that ended up becoming interceptions, but for all intents and purposes, Josh Love was the biggest reason this team lost. Yes, the Panthers didn't run the ball incredibly well, and yes, they did beat the Maulers technically in offensive stats, but when the Maulers are getting really good field position compared to the Panthers, I mean, come on. Look, the game wasn't even close. Josh Love threw 4 interceptions, and the Maulers didn't turn the ball over once, and that basically was why they lost, because, quite frankly, the Panthers' defense was overall better. Naturally, I'm saying without the interceptions, because I think like 2 of them were drop passes. But overall, the Panthers' defense was better. Now, the Maulers only had 9 more plays, yet despite having 9 more plays, the Panthers ended up getting 24 more tackles. And more importantly, they had 1 more sack and 4 more TFLs. So the Panthers' defense did their job. Now, the Maulers did have an insane 8 pass deflections. But overall, the Panthers' defense played good enough for them to win this game. They only allowed 19 points despite the Panthers turning the ball over 4 times. So the offense was the reason they lost this game. The defense was out on the field for 37 minutes. It was able to do this good a performance. This is a huge shame because, like I said, the Panthers their defense really gave it their all. But the Maulers, they got the W, and the Panthers defense kind of floundered or the offense floundered when it mattered. So, hey, you know what? Both teams are able to make the playoffs next week, so we'll see. Then the Showboats Breakers, another blowout by a team against the Showboats. I mean, it's like I said in the power rankings. It happened again. Look, the Showboats put up far more yards. In fact, they were more efficient in yards per play, but they had 5 turnovers, 3 picks, 2 fumbles lost. MBT didn't throw the ball a lot, but he didn't need to. Overall, when you compare stats to Kelly, they really were identical except TD interception ratio. That's why that one guy who threw only 16 times had a 92.7 passer rating, and a guy who threw 41 times ended up having a 41.1. Simply put, the guy who was more safe with the ball ended up getting the W. One team turned the ball over too much, the other team didn't. I know that some of you will say that, if the breakage didn't happen because there was a huge break due to the storm and ended up having a lot of people leave the game, maybe the Shows could have made a comeback, but honestly, it feels like this would have just been like the Stallions game all over again. And instead of being beat by 28, they might have been beaten by 38. So I'll get to it later, but the Showboats are effectively eliminated from the playoffs. They're not technically, but we'll get to that. But yeah, overall, bad game for them. Stallions versus Gamblers. The MVP race. Whoever won this game was probably going to win MVP, so now we basically know that Magoo will win it. Magoo had an outstanding game, talked about in the power rankings, but as for the Gamblers, they had 3 extra drives, a lot more plays, but were far less efficient despite having the ball for much longer. They got blown out. Why? Well, Nick Vogel should not go 5 for 5 in field goals in a game where you're not winning. It's like, because this is another performance of a 5 for 5 or better kicker performance where a kicker did insane, but he shouldn't have had to. That's saying you in 5 separate occasions you were at least within the 40 and you couldn't score a touchdown. Yeah, no wonder you guys lost 38-15, because you're talking about like you could have just a couple touchdowns would have made that score go up to 30, and 3 would have made it go up to like near 40. So, in a lot of ways, yeah, the game was really blue this one. Mark Thompson had a very mediocre game, literally just mediocre. He had 1 long rush, and considering the fact like Darius Victor did that many rushing yards in 11 attempts, yikes. And the fact is that it played both Kozar and Bahar, and neither of them looked that good. So the Gamblers, they're looking very sketchy, and that's a big reason why I think they're going to lose next week to the Gamblers. But we'll see. They're still alive, but Stallions, congrats to making the playoffs. Last game was the Generals Stars. This was a wild one. It looked like the Generals were easily going to win this when they scored a touchdown earlier in the 4th quarter. Then the Stars got a touchdown. They stopped the Generals. Got another touchdown. Stopped the Generals again. Then they failed to convert in their second to last drive and ended up having to settle for a field goal. And then they went for the 4th and 12 and actually got it, but they ended up fumbling the ball. But even that fumble is a bit, if you just see it like that, it doesn't actually tell it. They basically fumbled it to lose the game. They were at like 4th down when that happened. The Stars nearly won this game despite fumbling the ball 3 times. The Stars were, for all intents and purposes, the better team in a lot of ways, except for the fact the Generals played like they had nothing to lose. If this Generals team shows up next week, they're going to make the playoffs. They had a lot of crazy plays from 2 separate non-QBs passing the ball, from just outstanding plays by other players, a great return. Generals, they really let it all out there. Hopefully it doesn't end up biting them in the back when they go to the next game, but we'll see. So congrats to the Generals for winning that game. Now, as for players of the week, the offensive player of the week ended up being Darius Victor. Now, all these players of the week, there were really 2 of them that were very questionable, and this was one of them. Darius, don't get me wrong, had a really great game. Essentially, Victor ended up having 11 attempts for 51 yards with along with only 9, so he averaged a really solid yards per attempt with 2 touchdowns. He did have one 12-yard reception, but the big one was the fact that he threw a passing touchdown in the red zone for a 1-yard pass. It was a great play call. In fact, I would argue it looked to be kind of just like a random in the moment using the USFL passing rule. But I digress. He had a really solid game. It's just that, someone like Case Cookus ended up playing in front of an awful offensive line, ended up having an insanely good stat line himself. And Alex Magoo had a really solid performance. It feels like people just wanted to give, the Twitterverse wanted to give Darius Victor his first offensive player of the week because he hasn't had one yet. But I don't know. Overall, I think it was a solid performance he had, but I just don't think that it was better than 2 of the other Player of the Week nominees. Granted, I don't know why Wes Hills was nominated. I don't know who in their right mind thought that was a good idea, but I think Victor, solid performance. I don't think he deserved Offensive Player of the Week over the 2 QBs, but overall, very solid performance. Then, of course, we have Defensive Player of the Week being Quentin Poling again. Another controversial one. He had 11 tackles, 8 solo, half a sack, 2 TFLs, 1 interception, and 1 pass deflection. But again, it's kind of questionable because Kiava Tezino ended up having 7 tackles, which is 4 less, but he had 2 interceptions compared to his 1 and 3 pass breakups compared to the 1 pass defense. Then Vontae Diggs himself had like an interception, a pass breakup, and a TD. And then even Chris Orr had a really solid game himself, but I think he was the 4th of all of them. I think this was just the Birmingham Stallions' love on Twitter and all that, since they're one of the most popular, the most popular team at the moment. Because, I think Quentin had a much more deserving game compared to the competition than Victor had. I think that overall he really wasn't the best of all of them. So, this might be controversial, but I don't really think he deserved it as much as the other 2 guys that I mentioned did, but still a very solid performance, so congrats to him. Then last was another close one and kind of controversial, was Cam Eckler winning it. Now, eliminating the special teams performance, he had a great game. He also threw a 14-yard pass. And then he received 4 passes for 13 yards. But the big reason he won it was because he had an 85-yard kickoff return touchdown, as well as 3 other returns for decent yardage and 1 single-yard punt return. Now, in terms of his competition, really the only one was that you had Nick Vogel, who went 5 for 5 in total field goals. That's a very, very solid performance, but I do understand why the Twitterverse didn't want to vote for, a kicker, because usually, like I've said before, whenever you see a kick return touchdown, it's basically guaranteed he's going to win it. So overall, congrats to all those players of the week. A couple of them, very questionable. I think it's just the Twitterverse doing their thing for their teams, but overall, solid performances. Congrats to all the guys. In terms of home attendance, we only had the showboats, and sorry for the really low-quality pictures. I couldn't really get any good ones this time. But important thing to note, this is from the first quarter, late in the first quarter. Usually like the second quarter is when you have the peak attendance. That's why I try to get the pictures. And also the fact that the Lightning ended up costing them. A lot of people went home and the game ended up resuming with a lot of those people. But for when the game was on, once again, they did better than the Express. They definitely had over 12,000 people again. Very solid crowd like they've had basically every week except like 1 week. Hopefully this last week they'll have a really great showing. It'll be basically the Send-Home game, like I'll get to later, about why their postseason chances are so low. But unlike Birmingham, Memphis and Detroit have been really solid in attendance-wise, and I expected Detroit to have also really great attendance this last week. So we'll see. Overall, congrats to the Memphis crowd for being really good. It sucks that you guys had to end up seeing a team get blown out 17 points and then have a storm happen and all that. Now TV ratings. So, in terms of the games this week, the Panthers Maulers on Fox had 700,000. The Breakers Showboats, which is both on NBC and CNBC, ended up having like 530,000. That's a weird number. Then the Stallions Gamblers on Peacock slash NBC at 670,000, and then the Stars Generals had 900,000 on Fox. First things first, this is why you have primetime games. I don't know why they haven't been doing it, but I mean, I get there's some competition, but guess what? You had it on primetime, and people watched it. 900,000 is the second best number on Fox all season. Is a very solid number. Now, in terms of the CNBC and Peacock games, naturally, there's a lot of asterisks on those games. The Breaker Showboats was supposed to be on NBC. It was, and that's where it averaged most of that 530,000 viewers. But then it got basically postponed due to all the, stormage. And it ended up having like 40,000 or something really low in CNBC. So while it was on air, it had about 500,000 for the very beginning, and that number was probably going to grow considering the fact that during the blackout, it still had like 450,000 viewers. And then the other one started on Peacock because they had to push the game early due to weather, and then it played on NBC after the French Open. So both those numbers are very low compared to normal NBC, but there's a huge asterisk on it. Primetime game, you had it after a NASCAR race, you had it in primetime, and what'd you get? A great number. Now, compared to last year, very solid. Their Fox game beat last year's Fox game. Granted, their Fox game wasn't on primetime, but it was better than their primetime FS1 game. So, really good sign there. And then their 700,000 on the other game matched the 4 p.m. nearly Bandits Breakers game. So, another solid one. Overall, very solid TV viewership, especially compared to the XFL as well. The XFL's ABC game did have overall a better number considering the fact that was on 12:30 p.m. versus 7 p.m. primetime. But to be fair, their primetime game on a secondary network is actually even worse than the USFL's last year. And then ESPN, which is basically for sports nearly the same, if not the same as an over-the-air network, ended up both having under 700,000. They basically matched what the two NBC/random games had. So overall, the USFL this week was a very big W compared to week 9s of the past. This was definitely the best week 9 across all three, seasons we've had of spring football in the true modern era, post XFL suspension 2020. So that's a good sign. Now, the numbers should have been much better, but due to the weather, we ended up not having it. We legitimately should have seen all 4 games have over 700,000 people watching, but due to the weather, we ended up not having it happen, which is a shame, but overall solid numbers. And then last but not least is the standings and all that. Stars, Generals, Maulers, Panthers is the order of the North. Stars are 4 and 5, rest is 3 and 6. In the South, you have the 7 and 2 Stallions at 1, the 6 and 3 Breakers at 2, and then the 5 and 4 Gamblers and 5 and 4 Showboats at 3 and 4. Stallions have clinched the playoffs. They clinch the division, which granted doesn't really matter since both teams end up playing in the same hub, so we already know where the playoff game is going to be in Birmingham, so they get home field advantage essentially. But they clinched the division with a win or a Breakers loss. And then the North is very simple. The Stars, Panthers, whoever wins is in. Then in the South, the other game, the Maulers, Generals, whoever wins is in. Very simple, very easy to understand. There's no real tiebreakers. If you win, you're in. You lose, you're out in the North. The South is a bit different. The Gamblers can beat the Breakers, and the Showboats beat the Stallions, and the Breakers still can make the playoffs. In fact, that's the most probable one. Essentially, pending on how the Panthers game goes out, we'll see all 3 teams finishing with, let's just say this. If the Breakers lose to the Gamblers and the Showboats beat the Stallions, all 3 teams will finish at 6 and 4. So they're tied there. If the Panthers beat the Stars, all 3 teams are also tied in both who they've beaten in the division, head-to-head record, and the record overall, due to the fact that if that outcome were to happen, each team went 1-1 against each team in the South. So then it would go to point spread and all that stuff, or the point differential. Once you get to that, the Breakers already have a huge lead in everybody else, to where the Gamblers would have to win that game by a substantial amount to even be ahead of the Breakers, and the Showboats have to have an even more amount. I think the best tweet I saw was that the Showboats would have to win by 36 and have the Gamblers win by 26. That's the most realistic way they can make it. And of course, they need the Panthers to win. So essentially what really matters is how bad do the Gamblers beat the Breakers if they beat them. If it's a close game, the Breakers will still make the playoffs, win or lose. So for all intents and purposes, all you Breakers fans, and I got a couple of dire Breakers fans in the comment, your team, if you guys missed the playoffs, you guys really blew it. The Breakers have the easiest road to the playoffs of all the 7 teams fighting for it, because they don't even have to win, they just have to not get blown out. So They should be fine. We should have the Breakers be the other team in the South, making a rematch of that. And to be honest, we could have a rematch with all four of the same teams making the playoffs, which is hilarious. But we'll see. Overall, this has been Zom Fox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We do at least 3 videos a week, but well, the season's basically over. Essentially, after this week, we have one more video this week, and then we have a lot of videos coming out next week for the playoffs and all that. So be on the lookout for those. As always, have a great night.